awake? Yeah? Good. All right. So today we are talking about the balancing act in WordPress, balancing act of caching in WordPress specifically. And I'm Maura Teal. I am a WordPress developer by trade. Now actually I'm focusing on PHP APIs with Pagely as a software engineer. And previously I worked on a site called Fansided at Time Inc. So you might also know about me that I am an emoji and meme enthusiast. I maintain my own repo of Slack emoji, and I recently got a license plate that helps commit me to the internet culture. So as we kind of move on, you might notice a couple of memes in there, like this. So what about caching? What do we want to talk about today? Well, when we're talking about caching, we're talking about data that's stored in an easily accessible place, somewhere that's a little bit quicker to get to than making a full-on database call, making a remote API call on every single page load. We're making data more quickly accessible so that we can improve performance of a site. And what type of caching could we be doing? Well, there's object caching, which means that we're storing data in the server, so in memory, using something like Redis or Memcached. Now, this is kind of advanced mode in that you need to install Memcached or Redis on your server. But alternatively, we do have database storage, which out of the box for PHP, the Transients API does this in your WP options table. It stores key value pairs of information so that they're a little bit more quickly accessible. We've also got custom tables in Meta that we can utilize as caching. And a little outside of the scope of this talk, but worth mentioning, is local browser-level caching, browser-level storage. So I want to just get this out in the open right now. When we're talking about caching, we're talking about data that we've given an expiration date to, a maximum life. That data is not forever. This provides a huge amount of value in that this data expires. We always need to go and refetch it. But it also creates a bit of a balancing act. You can't rely on that information always being there. It might expire in half an hour, but 5 minutes into that lifespan of the data, someone might clear the cache. I don't know if you've been there, but I definitely have. And it creates a specific amount of planning to know that that data might not be there even when you need it to be. So let's talk about a quick win for your basic WordPress blog. You've just got information that you need to share. You want to make it as fast as possible. A lot of hosts leverage this mechanism of full page caching. Full page caching would be the PHP renders all of the output, makes all the database calls once for the first user that hits a page. After that, it serves up this rendered HTML that it's stashed away in cache. This is lightning fast in some cases and is, again, a very quick win. It can be set up with a plugin. Again, it can be set up on your managed host. Not a ton of know-how needed, and for basic blogs, that's all you need. Except when you're dealing with lots of logged-in users. So one of the things that managed hosts have figured out already, and these plugins have already taken into account, is that you can't cache the data that admin-side users see. You don't want to be caching that information. They need to know what they're updating in real time. Same with logged-in users on the front end of a site. They need to see unique to them content. So we've got to think of some different ways to handle cache data for them. Similarly, frequently changing content can be a little bit of a challenge when we're talking about full page caching. If you've got data that could last for 24 hours, but something else on the page that should be refreshed every 5 minutes or live, we can think about the challenges that might come up. One of the very easy things to take care of when we're talking about full page caching versus something like comments is to utilize Ajax. So we've got the fully rendered HTML, but we are not including the comments on our page load. We just have some JavaScript that Ajax is in the comments live once the user scrolls down and views that section of the screen. Ajax is a really handy mechanism to utilize full page caching, but still pull in bits of data that might need to be live. But it can be overused, it can be abused. You could have a page that makes 30 different Ajax calls thinking we need fresh data here, oh, and we need it here, and we need it down here. So again, you need to balance whether you're going to quickly serve up one page via PHP, maybe with all static assets, versus loading things in via Ajax. So in short, one does not simply cache all the things when it comes to your more than basic blog. So what do we cache? Well, let's talk about that. Once we start talking about cache, we need to focus our efforts in specific places. We're improving the performance of a site by utilizing caching, and we can store it in different ways. For example, we can take the header of a site and store that, just a full chunk of rendered data. We could take a sidebar widget, store that as a cached value after making remote PHP call or remote execution, things like that. We could store the end data as rendered HTML. I don't necessarily advise that, though. My preference is to store things like JSON, to store things like the remote request result. So at the end, we can flex that into whatever front-end pattern or whatever other usage we need. We can reuse some of that cached data a little bit more flexibly. So we've determined you want to cache things. These are the APIs that you're going to use. There's WP cache set, WP cache get. Those two APIs, those two methods, are a little bit more advanced level. They tend to tie in with object caching. So again, you need that wired into your server. But you have the advantage here of utilizing cache groups. This makes some of the cached items more flexible. Say you have a group of remote API calls that you want to cache. Say you need to be able to expire them, but not everything else on your site. This is where it's extremely handy, but again, it's a little bit more advanced mode. That leaves us with the Transients API. This is what most people will be frequently comfortable with when you step into the world of caching in WordPress. It's perfectly valid, and some hosts even can set up the transients to wire into object caching, so you can take advantage of some of the faster times with that, instead of loading things into the WP options table. So I would highly recommend reading up on using transients and building them into your plugin or theme with whatever remote calls you're making, if they seem like they'd be cacheable, or even long-running MySQL calls. So how would you do it? This is a simple method that is fetching cached data, checking to see if it exists, false if it doesn't exist, or if it's expired, and then returning and recaching that information. This is all you need to know when we're talking about caching. So, do you need to cache more? Well, yeah, obviously. But there are quite a few things that inform my decision-making when it comes to caching. This is my short list of items that I tend to check when I'm looking over a site, trying to decide where should I focus all of my efforts? Where can I make the biggest impact on improving the performance of a site? So performance indicators are a big thing. Looking at speed, memory usage, CPU. That tends to be the thing at scale that as a hosting company at Pagely, we find we improve once our customers utilize caching a little bit more, say in a sluggish area on their site. The page load time in general, just the speed that it takes to load the page, isn't the whole story. We need to drill down a little bit more. We need to look at how much memory was used, look how many calls to the database end up happening. My favorite tool for this is New Relic, hands down. It can give you a 30,000-foot view of the current health of the site. It can give you a historical view of the health of the site, of the performance, of all of the API calls made. But Query Monitor, which is free, you can install it on your site right now, is easy to use and can still inform a lot of those decisions that you need to make. Next is traffic indicators. And I'm not just talking about upticks in traffic that you already know. Say your client is featured on Shark Tank. That's a traffic indicator that, hey, maybe you need to prepare. Maybe there's some more caching you can do. Maybe you can extend out the time of page cache. Instead of cache living for half an hour, you could expend it to 6 hours, something like that. But I'm not just talking about traffic spikes and indicators like that. I'm talking about day-to-day traffic, hour-to-hour traffic. Maybe you've got a lot of admin level traffic that you need to focus on and serve information to. Obviously, you need to balance that with the fact that admins generally need to see up-to-date information, but maybe there's something that you can take care of, drill down to, and focus on that you can improve speed and performance with. So the other item is use of external APIs. And I have a lot of personal experience with this in a site setup that I used to work on, where we had a remote API that we talked to frequently to get things like related posts, and data about the site, data from mobile apps, things like that. In that case, not only did we need to protect our site because we were fetching data so frequently, we needed to reduce server-to-server handshake time that it even took, so we wouldn't want to pass that off to our end user. But we also needed to protect this remote API because we had to maintain that too. So when you're maintaining a remote API that's talking to a bunch of different sources, you start thinking about the fact that you'll have to rate limit incoming calls. That's costly. You'll have to think about serving all of that information dependably. What happens if the remote API server goes down and you're still making calls to it? You're going to time everyone out. Even if you have cached data, that data is going to expire at some point and you're going to have to refetch it. So what do you do in those cases? Something to think about. The other little item that I wanted to mention is the browser cache API. So let's take a little segue, take a little detour, and talk about the browser cache API. So the browser cache API is a fully front-end focused solution. And when we're referring to this, we're thinking about more fully front-end user-based applications. The browser cache API isn't totally cross-browser compatible. I don't think IE supports it at all. But there are a couple of other JavaScript browser front-end caching APIs, like local storage maybe, that you could review if you think this is something that you could utilize. But with great power comes great responsibility. Here's just a little code snippet of how you might access browser cache. It's fully JavaScript API, all front-end based. But you have to be careful how much data you're storing, because you are literally passing this information off and storing it on your end user's machine, much like a cookie gets stored in the browser. So if you're replacing cookies, that's all well and good. If you're taking the full result of a JSON API response and storing that in your end user's browser, you might have problems. Fun story, this actually happened to a developer I know where they thought, oh, I'm going to use this shiny new browser cache API, stored the result that made sense for the end user, and a bunch of users got a notice on their mobile phone saying that a site was requesting an unnecessarily large amount of storage. So you need to protect your user and use this with care. But I still thought it was worth bringing up that browser caching is going to get utilized more and more often. And it plays into the layers of caching that we always have to consider when we're working with sites at scale. Frankly, even when we're working with small sites, this is something we need to consider. Have you ever used Cloudflare for a client and said, oh, well, you know, it's just cached. I cleared it on the server. It's fine. And then they have 10 more visitors visit the site and see old data because that needs cleared too. Same issue with browser cache. You could end up with data stored in there. And if you don't clear it properly, if you don't maintain it properly, you're going to end up in the same crazy rabbit hole of finding out why this end user is still seeing this darn A where it shouldn't be. So let's talk about a couple other of the lessons I've learned at scale. And one of the first ones I want to talk about is cache warming is real. It's a thing. It's something we need to consider. What happens if someone does a cache clear, but you've relied on it so heavily that to rewarm it, it takes so long for every user that's hitting your site and you've got regular traffic that it brings down the site? You're significantly reducing load. And if you've got a site that's tuning right along and you're caching things and caching a couple more things and caching a few more things on top of that, you could dig yourself quite the large hole when something goes wrong and you need to clear out that data. Say you've cached a bad set of data that needs cleared out. Next is load testing, and this is something that at Pagely we recommend to so many of our clients. You should be prepared to understand how your site performs under heavy load. You should be prepared to understand what might happen after half an hour of heavy load when that cache clears. You should be prepared to understand and have that knowledge ready at hand for this traffic. It's a huge, powerful tool. It's a whole talk in and of itself, but I highly recommend you consider it if you're looking to work at scale. And next, expired cache does not mean that cached value necessarily goes away, especially if we're talking about WP transients out of the box that live in your WP options table. Say you've installed a plugin that does its own caching and it's filling up that table with a bunch of values, and then you uninstall that plugin. Well, the way the caching works is it's looking at that expiration value only the next time you call the data. So if you call data by a key, say my transient value, I need this key. WordPress says, okay, well this is expired, let me go get you a new one, and then deletes the row. If you create the value in the database and never call it again for some reason, say testing, or again you uninstalled something, that information just sits there. So unless you have some sort of garbage collection, some sort of managed host that already has taken care of this, don't assume that the information, once it's expired, actually degrades and just goes poof. There's a little bit of management and a little bit of care, just like leaving meta floating around a database that you need to clean up after. So finally, cache all you want, but you still need to write performant code. One of the big things that people say you should cache or you could cache is a long-running MySQL query. So say you've got a 12-second, 15-second, good Lord, maybe 20 seconds of a MySQL query. You've got some intense data lookup you need to do in a big, big database full of thousands, million rows. That could take a long time, but there is some way to optimize it, and you should do your absolute best to get all of the code optimizations in that you can before you say, oh, cache will fix it. You can't keep throwing cache at something when the underlying code isn't performant. So I encourage everyone to, go utilize caching and use it more, but also continue to strive to write better code. So I'm way, way ahead of time, but I really wanted to just allow some time for Q&A. My name's Maura Teal, and if you aren't comfortable asking your question out here, then feel free to find me after. I'm always happy to chat, and I'm sure Pagely will buy you a beer. So, thanks.
Who has questions for Maura? Because I do. Did somebody else raise their hand? Okay.
So when you're dealing with like user data, obviously you can't cache that. You have to be discrete in the way you do that. But how is there a threshold you've reached where, say, if you have like 1,000 users and you're caching all that on the server and you're storing that, at what point do you say, well, I can't cache this anymore, or do you start going into the database? Because some of these users may not go back to the database, or so they may not go back to the user for like months.
Frankly, I think at that point, if it's a very user-heavy experience, much like a lot of front-end apps, provide a loading experience, right? Temporary cache that has good garbage collection that will clean up after a user session is over or something like that is probably the most useful thing. But leave a little bit of time at the beginning, a little hello screen. Look at Slack's app, right? They have hello screens and randomized messages that help you wait for that data to load in, because obviously it needs to serve up fresh data. It needs to serve up fresh messages that you're getting. So if it's really user heavy like that, I would say build in a little bit of wait time, a little bit of other visual activity around it, and go from there. I hope that answers your question.
So my question is more, not so much on the technical side, but I would just love to hear about the worst performance horror story that you've witnessed. Like, what's something you've seen and just like had like total eye roll and like, holy cow, how did this ever happen in the first place?
You know what? I can't say I've had that looking at someone else's code. We came up with a really interesting caching mechanism for one of the larger sites that I worked on, again, the site that worked with a remote API, where we needed to be serving this remote information, but we were also okay to get away with serving expired data. So the most efficient way to do that was to create our own caching mechanism where we stored the result of a remote call into a database table and pulled that up. So even once it was expired, it got marked as expired in the database, and then a cron job went and fetched that information again in the background on a utility server. So on one hand, it's brilliant. Like, the user never has to wait for that data to refresh. We can pull it up at any time. On the other hand, if for some reason that data, again, is corrupt, or the utility server cron jobs stop running because the WP cron jobs by default are not the most dependable thing, especially once you have things starting to stack up and long-running calls. Yeah, both servers can fall over if all of that goes to hell. Heck. So yeah, that was kind of a self-inflicted thing. But it was one of the most fun and clever things to work on. At the same time, it was the scariest thing possible because the site performance hung in the balance.
Awesome, thank you. More questions? Yep.
So you talked about like the cost of purging cache, and I see so many times that clients or even sometimes developers will go in and click that like clear all cache button. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about selective cache purging and the importance of kind of building that in and some strategies.
Ooh, yes. So selective cache purging strategies. This is another interesting one for admin-heavy traffic. Say you've got a lot of people publishing, and every time someone publishes, it purges the whole cache of the site for some reason. Building in, especially utilizing the Transients API to use something like delete cache. So you can, or deleting a cache group, say, when you're using object caching, is the best route, I would say, to look into. Look at specific data that you're updating and what other pieces throughout your application that might be affected, and you can preemptively clear those bits of cache to avoid the user ever having to feel like they need to go hit a clear cache button somewhere. As a developer, you can be a little bit smarter about it because you have an awareness of what's happening throughout the rest of the application. You don't need just the blog post to clear cache. You need the blog post plus the homepage to clear. Or maybe you need to educate your administrators that, oh yeah, that updates every 5 minutes. So they don't feel stressed about the fact that something's not coming up right away. At scale, and for writers on, say, a large blogging platform who are all working toward the same end goal and working on the same site, a little education and preparation on that side always makes a big difference. So it's that. That's a whole long topic in and of itself, for sure.
Anybody else? Other side of the room. Come on, man.
Thank you so much for the talk. One of the discussions I frequently find myself in with other developers is when is the best time to introduce caching to their website? Is it as you're building a feature? Is it just before launch? Is it as you're prepping for a large event that you know is coming? Can you talk a little bit about what you found the best time to focus on caching to be?
Yeah, the best time to focus on caching in the development process. I'd say earlier is always better. So if you know that you've got to run a MySQL call, and you know you'll be able to cache that and control when you delete the cache and purge it yourself, there's no reason you shouldn't go ahead and implement it, especially if you've got object caching set up and ready to go. As a developer, I realize this can be a little bit frustrating, but it also prepares you for the potential user experience. It also prepares you for when you go ahead and load test and you go, oh no, I could use more to get performance out of it. Or maybe you could just start with full page caching and run a couple of tests after you have an initial front-end app built. To me, there's really no bad time to start. So it doesn't hurt to introduce small pieces. And again, that's where I would focus is small pieces first. Cache that MySQL call, cache a JSON response that you've put together and have ready to go, and build from there.
Sure, nobody in the back corner wants a question?
Real quick, you talked about how the data cache, just because it's expired doesn't mean it's deleted, and you kind of have to garbage collect some of that. Do you have any experience with like what a good strategy for that might be, the garbage collection, in terms of, we could use the set transient method as an example?
I'm spoiled now because even before I moved to Pagely, I had managed hosting who helped me with it as a partner. So I really didn't have to worry about it all that much. I think about it on my own personal site because I tinker with managing my own server. But I would say just go look. Go check out and do some data cleanup in your database, because just like you might want to clean out old meta that's unused from old plugins of yesteryear or old themes that have now totally unnecessary data stored away, you could clear that out. And if you've built your caching right, once you do clear it out, only the new good stuff will repopulate. So especially if you've got a slow night, you're clearing things out on the server anyhow, you've got a maintenance mode window, that's a good time to do some of that cleanup, or test it out on staging. Click around and see what comes back up.
Anybody else? All right, one more.
Can you talk more about the browser caching? What is it? What do you use it for typically? How does it differ from local storage?
No. My focus is on PHP mostly. I realize that they're different APIs, the browser cache API and local storage. Local storage has been around longer as far as I'm aware. But beyond that, I know in the modern era of front-end applications is where this is most usable. And personally, other than recommendations on what type of data you should store, which would be small, maybe cookie replacements or session-related information, I couldn't really dive too much into the details of the JavaScript caching world.
Awesome. Thanks, Maura.
Thank you.